Blind Bartimaeus encounters the Lord. This is a reading from the Public Life of our Lord Jesus Christ, Volume 2, by Most Reverend Alban Goodier, S.J., Chapter 34, Section 102, The Blind Men at Jericho. The road from the Jordan led in a direct line across the rising plain to Jericho. The town lay at the foot of the hills of Judea. On the right, as they went along, the mountains of Ephraim began to rise, reaching on past Jericho into Samaria. Among those mountains, close behind the city, Jesus had fasted 40 days at the outset of his career. The hills in front shut out Jerusalem from them. At Jericho, the road swerved to the left, seeking the most even course among the valleys, till it reached Bethania at the eastern side of Olivet. There it forked. One route to the right went over the mountain and dropped into the valley of Kedron beyond. The other swerved round the base of Olivet, meeting the first again before it turned into the northeastern gate of Jerusalem. Along this well-beaten track, more trodden by Jesus than any other that we know, he was now making his way for the last time. It was indeed a road of many memories. Up that route the Hebrews had come when they first entered the Promised Land. The fall of the Jericho that then was had been the beginning of the conquest under Joshua. Round about this spot the name of Elysius still lingered. The well whose waters he had made sweet still supplied the people of the city. It is there to this day, with an orange grove beside it. He came up the road, entered the busy town, and passed through it. We have no record that Jesus ever stayed in Jericho, as we have no record that he ever stayed in Tiberias. Tiberias was Roman, given up to all that was most characteristic of Roman life. Jericho was stamped with the luxury of Herod the Great. To have preached in either of these places would have been the sheerest waste of time. He came up from the Jordan during the morning, and as he came, many that knew him followed after. In Jericho he rested at midday, and through the early afternoon. As the sun began to slope over Jerusalem and the hills of Judea, he set out again in the direction of Bethania and the holy city. There were many with him. The gatherings in this part of Judea had long since rivaled those of the early days in Galilee. There were many friends from the country round about, friends who had listened to the Baptists and who had been won by him, friends who, especially in these last months, had heard Jesus himself and had seen the things he had done. There were also many who would call themselves neither friends nor enemies, for Jericho was a city of luxury and pleasure, famous for its fruits and flowers and merrymaking, and Jesus was a new excitement in their midst. And there were enemies. It may not be many at this point, but the spies and emissaries of those in Jerusalem were never far away, and they had long since learnt to keep him always in sight. Up the lane as they came out of the city was the usual spectacle. There were travelers coming down from Jerusalem. It was just a day's journey on foot, with their asses and perhaps a camel making their way into Jericho for the night. There were loiterers along the road whose day's work was done and who were taking their rest in the evening sun. By the roadside were beggars, among them 2 blind men, one of whom was well known to the people of Jericho. His name was Bartimaeus, which is to say the son of Timaeus. He had begged at that spot many an afternoon and knew how to interpret the sounds of the travelers that went by him to and fro. But today was evidently something unusual. The crowd came along out of the city. There was much talk and enthusiasm. Still, it was not the noise of a marriage procession, which Bartimaeus knew well, nor of a funeral, for there was no lamentation, nor yet was it the tumultuous rout of a Herod and his retinue making its way to Jerusalem for the coming festival. It might indeed be a gathering of pilgrims from Galilee or Perea or elsewhere, for several had passed by of late. Still, even so, There was something about the tumult of this crowd that sounded different from others. Bartimaeus was curious. As the stream of enthusiasts passed by him where he sat, he pulled one by the coat. He asked him what all this enthusiasm meant. Everybody knew Bartimaeus. He had no fear of being passed over by the common populace. They answered his question more than one at once. Quote, they told him that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by. Jesus of Nazareth. So that was the name by which he was still known among the people. His presence, his teaching, his miracles had not yet succeeded in making men speak of him as anything but this, Jesus of Nazareth. But to Bartimaeus, it was different. He had long sat by the roadside and had had ample time to ponder many things. The stories concerning Jesus of Nazareth had been much discussed in his neighborhood. Nowhere more than here had he found both friends and enemies. Reports of the wonders he had wrought in Galilee had come down the road. But even here in Judea, though the miracles had been fewer, yet had they been more striking and momentous. Not least had been the healing of the man born blind outside the Temple of Jerusalem at the Feast of Tabernacles a few months ago. That had set all Judea talking. Many on its account had espoused his cause, declaring him to be the Messiah. Since that day, he had been more than usual in that district and had confirmed the impression by what he had said and done. 2 other blind men he had healed. He had released a demoniac, deaf and dumb. In a synagogue, he had made a bent old woman stand up straight. Last of all, up the road at Bethania, he had actually raised a dead man from the tomb. Bartimaeus had pondered upon all he had heard and had long since made up his mind. Jesus of Nazareth was no ordinary man. John the Baptist had said so beforehand, and all he had heard since confirmed it. Should ever Jesus pass that way again, 2 things he would do. He would confess his belief in him, and he would ask him to restore him his sight. And now he had his opportunity. The crowd was moving on, taking little notice of Bartimaeus and his companion. Unless they did something, Jesus would pass by in the middle of the throng and would not so much as see them. He must act at once. He must attract attention. He believed, better than many in that noisy crowd believed, and he would not go unnoticed. Quote, who, when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, began to cry out and to say, Jesus, O Lord, thou Son of David, have mercy on us. It is to be noticed that in these parts this was evidently something new. The people were enthusiastic, but their actions showed they were not used to miracles. What had been common and even expected in Galilee, what was not surprising in Samaria, in Decapolis, and Peroa, here in Judea, was an unusual and unlooked-for event. The crowd was satisfied with its own enthusiasm. It resented interference or interruption, such as that of Bartimaeus. Jesus was on his way up to the holy city and must not be interrupted by beggars such as he. Quote, and the multitudes that went before rebuked them, that they should hold their peace. But Bartimaeus was not to be silenced. He had begun in faith and confidence. In the same confidence and faith, let men say what they liked, he would continue. Nay, he would continue more vehemently than ever, and his companions shouted with him. Quote, but he cried out a great deal the more, saying, O Lord, thou Son of David, have mercy on us. The procession still passed on. Perhaps in the tumult, the voice of these beggars would not reach the ears of Jesus. But it was not so. He had come up the lane opposite to where the beggars sat, and there he stood still. His stopping for a moment silenced the noise about him. Through the silence, the cry of the blind men could be heard more distinctly than ever. He did not move toward them. He stood in the middle of the crowd, he turned in the direction of the spot from which the cries came and bade the blind men to be brought to him. At once there was a change in the attitude of the crowd. Was he about to work another wonder? There was a rush to the two blind men. If before they had blamed them, now the fickle people could only speak words of encouragement. What Jesus had done before, he might do again, and then they would indeed be happy men. Quote, "And Jesus, standing still, commanded them to be called. And they called the blind man, saying to him, Be of better comfort, arise, he calleth thee." Bartimaeus and his companion needed no second invitation. They lay there on their sacking by the roadside. Another piece of cloth covered them, partly from the sun, chiefly from the dust of the lane that rose in a cloud with every passer-by. At once they discarded their sackcloth. They leapt to their feet. They stretched out their arms, groping in their darkness, that they might find their way to him who was their hope. Eagerly the crowd led them to him. Men stood aside for them, closed in upon them from behind. In a very few moments they were in his presence, in the middle of the lane, and perhaps did not know it. Jesus stood and looked at them. Always had he been particularly tender with the blind. His curing of the blind had been the first claim among his miracles. The curing of the blind was particularly symbolic of him who was the light of the world. These men, besides, had proved their faith. They had shown that they believed he could heal them. More than that, they had called him Son of David. Here on the road up from Jordan, where John the Herald had announced the coming of the king, these blind men had declared their recognition of his royalty. The people still might call him just Jesus of Nazareth. These blind men hailed him, Jesus, Son of David. Not yet so much as the Christ, the Son of the living God. Nevertheless, for the light that was given to them, a good and heroic confession. Such faith could never go unrewarded. Still, there was one consolation which, of late especially, Jesus did not disdain. He loved to be asked a favor. He would sometimes try his petitioners, just that they might be provoked to ask him the more. The men had been brought to a standstill in front of him. Not knowing where they stood, they waited for a sign, and he gave it. He looked into the face of Bartimaeus, of him who had been loudest in his appeal, and said to him, "What wilt thou that I do to thee?" The voice drew their faces to him. Before, they had not known which way to turn. Now they understood. With their blind eyes, they looked towards him. They were eager as they had never been before in all their lives. The people about held their breath in no less eager expectation. Bartimaeus had been addressed. Bartimaeus answered. "Lord, Rabboni," he said, "that our eyes be opened, that we may see." The face of Jesus changed. It softened as we have seen it soften many times before. These blind men believed, and it was enough. They asked something of him, and they should receive it. He had compassion on them. We have heard this of him in other places. For the moment, he seemed to forget all else, his own anxieties, the curious crowd about him. So preoccupied was he with the plight of those two blind men. He bent towards them as they crouched before him. His fingers touched their closed and sunken eyelids. To each he said with satisfaction in his voice, as if he were glad to do this thing. Go thy way, receive thy sight, thy faith hath made thee whole. The effect was instantaneous. He took his hands from their faces. As he did so, their eyes opened and they saw. They saw him. They saw the crowd about them. The joy of recovering the power they had long since lost overwhelmed them. Jesus moved away. The people thronged about the two men. The wonder that had been worked for the moment distracted them from him who had worked it. But not for long. Though others might forget him, Bartimaeus was not one who could. As before he had ignored the crowd, so he did now. He saw he would not leave him who had given him sight. If men came in between him and his benefactor, he would break through their midst and be with him. He would follow the Son of David, and as before, his companion would go with him. Quote, and immediately they saw and followed him in the way, glorifying God. The crowd could not but join with them. Though miracles in Judea had been few, nevertheless the people had long since known that Jesus had the power, though among them he seemed to confine himself to individual cases. Yet he could pour out his healing in abundance if he would. Among the common people of Judea, there was greater faith and understanding than there had ever been among the people of Galilee, and the future would prove that they would bear the greater fruit. Quote, and all the people, when they saw it, gave praise to God. The blind men at Jericho.